This week, I learned more about language and education step-by-step policy process. Policies that outline rules, regulations, and procedures related to educating ELL students are in the hands of federal government, state government, and voters. Court decisions occasionally impact policies as well. I also learned about the history and current language, education policies, legislations that have affected ELLs. As teachers, it's important to be aware of this history because it affects the everyday classroom. Bilingual education has been referred to as a 30-year experiment that started with the passage of the Federal Bilingual Education Act in 1968. Interestingly enough, 3 centuries ago, native instruction and bilingual education were common in areas in the U.S. where non-English speaking immigrant groups settled and made up the major portion. It was almost like the U.S. was embracing non-English speaking students and setting up a diverse future for themselves. The Americanization movement after World War I pushed the belief that to be American means to speak English only. Many restrictions were placed on German language instruction, and after World War II, Japanese language schools in California and Hawaii were closed. It was officially determined in the early 1900s that English would be used as the language of instruction in schools. Before 1968, there were no federal education language policy for ELLs. Schools had a sink-or-swim mentality when it came to the ELL students. With the civil rights movement, educators and policymakers became more sensitive to the needs of rapidly growing language minority students in the U.S. In the 1960s, concerned educators noticed that white students completed on an average 14 years of schooling, in contrast to Mexican American students that completed less than 5 years. Senator Ralph Yarborough of Texas introduced a bill to provide federal funding for schools districts to support bilingual education programs. His bill eventually became the 1968 Bilingual Education Act. Ironically, this bill did not include a definition of bilingual education. It was a step in the right direction, though, because it was the first piece of United States federal legislation that recognized the needs of limited English-speaking ability students. Then came the No Child Left Behind Act. President George Bush signed this act in 2002. It includes Title I provisions applied to disadvantaged students. To receive federal school funding, states had to give assessments to all students at select grade levels. This changed the way schools educated each and every student. In Chapter 3, we learned the No Child Left Behind Act required assessments for emerging bilinguals under Title I and Title III. This Title III of the No Child Left Behind Act was a game changer because schools were required to evaluate the English proficiency of all students enrolling for the first time in the school. It would establish the criteria to determine eligibility for programs and services for emergent bilinguals and implement appropriate educational services. In 2009, Common Core standards in English, language, arts, and mathematics were released. When the Common Core standards were adopted, educators immediately had to scramble to help prepare emergent bilinguals. Overall, these readings of the chapter and the article have taught me the evolution of our education system when it comes to emergent bilinguals, how far we've come, and how far we still need to go.